Now we're going to turn to your book. Thank you for humoring me with all those questions. Will you hold up your book one more time?
Doomed to Fail: Why Government is Incapable of Living Up to Our Hopes.
Yeah, which doesn't seem on its face like a book that would be attractive for the conference that I just read. But you know, it's interesting because your book opens up with this explanation of complex adaptive systems. I just immediately was devouring, and it's so interesting because, you know, yeah, for me, I read into it all of these things that I'm interested in. So I spent a lot of time thinking about climate disasters, insurance, mortgage financing, infrastructure, building, resiliency, those are the topics that I get so excited about. But when I read your opening chapter on complex adaptive systems, like I was putting all of that, and projecting it into your words. And that's not really what the rest of your book is about, is it? Like, you touch on these things here and there, but by and large, that's not what your book is about. And so I'm just curious, like, reacting to that. Like, do other people have that reaction too?
The book could have gone in many different directions. And the idea of these systems was first written about in the early 19th century. They have very wide applicability. They are highly non-linear. They tend to obey power laws. So the output is an input raised to some high power. So that means when there are small uncertainties or discrepancies in the value of an input, that can lead to massively magnified changes in the outputs. We're in the realms of the butterfly flapping its wings in the Philippines, giving rise to the formation of a hurricane over the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
That chaos theory, which describes that kind of behavior, that's a branch of complexity theory. Different parts of the system are deeply interconnected. So whereas the Stoic philosophers advocated solving complicated problems by breaking them up into component parts and then getting experts to solve each component and then reconstitute the whole, that method will work for complicated problems provided that they are linear. Right. But it won't work for problems that are non-linear. So it won't work for these kind of problems that we are talking about. It doesn't mean that people don't try to use those problems, use those kinds of solutions. Indeed, the Basel Committee that devises the regulations which are applied to banks for how much capital they should hold, they have this divide and conquer kind of strategy with capital for banks. They have separate components for credit risk, for market risk, for operational risk, and they treat these three risks as being completely separate. And you have credit risk modeling experts doing PD models and LGD models, market risk experts doing value at risk or expected shortfall, and so on, and similar with operational risk. But this breaking down a complex problem into these different components and having experts solve them, it's fundamentally flawed. And there's this, well-known phrase of, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail.
Right.
But the point is, be careful, be aware that these models that you're using are not truly applicable. You can have very little confidence in the outcome. It's the people who understand that the world is complex. It's a complex adaptive system. They're the ones who have the doubt, because they're wise enough to know that the nature of the thing, the situation we're dealing with is that of a complex adaptive system. And the future is fundamentally unknowable because of these properties of nonlinearity and deeply interconnected nature. And the fact that the systems are adaptive, they change and morph over time in ways that are completely unforecastable. And that's why you can never be overconfident in what you do.
So another part of your book that I really liked was chapter number 4, which was called In Praise of Diversity.
Yep.
And not the kind of diversity that we normally think about, right? Like not necessarily race or gender, although those could be included too, but diversity of thought being, the key thing to focus on. And because we're in this changing dynamic world, because we're in a place of complex adaptive systems where you can't just plug and play with the same old models and expect them to work. And I want to read just a couple quotes that I took from that chapter. So you talked about groupthink, monoculture leadership. It's quite a mouthful, but just so great as a description, is likely to result in us being blindsided by these changes that are happening, because we think that like we're on the correct models, on the correct path, and then you get taken by surprise, right? And the ability to adapt quickly to meet the demands of rapidly changing environment. We have to have diverse groups of thought and diverse people.
Yep. Yeah. So what people refer to as diversity in recent years is really better reflected by the bigger name, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's because what people have been practicing when they talk about diversity was equity and inclusion. Clearly, women, people of color are every bit as capable of doing high-powered jobs as are white men. But historically, they weren't allowed to. Social expectations were for women not to work, not to have high power jobs. Likewise, people of color. And that was clearly not equitable. It was clearly unfair. But those two things, they address the issues of equity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. They don't address the issue of diversity. Diversity is far more multifaceted than simply sex and skin color or sexual orientation or eye color or any other random thing. Mm-hmm. The only thing that really matters about diversity is diversity of thought, and that comes from diversity of experience and things like that. And that's what businesses should have. If the operating environment of a business was immutable, if it never changed, then you wouldn't actually want diversity. Right. You would want a management team, people working in the business who were perfectly matched for the environment that they had. You would still want equity inclusion. That's just fairness to be equitable and inclusive in your treatment of people. But you wouldn't actually want diversity. You'd want clones, because you'd want them to be perfectly matched to an environment, and the environment never changes. Yeah. The real world, however, that's not the way the environment is. The real world, the environment is adaptive. It does change. And so if you have a monoclonal culture, if you have a series of clones matching your business, matching what the environment was at the time you set it up, the environment then changes, you're going to be caught flat-footed. You're very likely to be completely blindsided by the changes and have no ability to have the agility and nimbleness in order to change and adapt to reflect the changes of the business environment that you operate in. And that's why businesses, all kinds of organizations, businesses, universities, government, and so on, they need a diverse group of people. But this is intellectual diversity of thought, in order to make them as agile and nimble and robust as possible to the changing environment that they face. You give your business the best opportunity that you can by making sure that it is diverse and nimble and agile, so that no matter what the environment throws at you in the future, your best place, you positioned yourself as well as you possibly can to be able to react to those changes and adapt accordingly.
Yeah, I love that. So, Paul, you are very concerned that right now democracy and capitalism are under threat. And I'm going to read some of the words that I wrote down the last time we spoke. Political extremism, acceptance of authoritarianism, the rise of autocratic leaders.
And in the book, I write about democracy is the best form of political organization. It's because as we live in a complex, adaptive society, once that policy is later on seen to fail and need to be changed, it's not credible for the politician to espouse a new policy, disavow his earlier one. That wouldn't be credible. So when we need to change a policy and society needs to take a new direction, we need to change the politician too. And this is the reason why democracy is so powerful. It's because it gives us a regular means of peacefully removing people from power and putting a new set of people into power, so that society can take a new direction. In an autocracy, in contrast, the leaders make mistakes in exactly the same way, but without a peaceful means of removing them from power, they tend to double down on their mistakes. Mm-hmm. They tend to repress minorities within their own population to drum up support amongst the majority. That's exactly what Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is doing with the Muslim Uyghurs in Western China. they tend to wage war on their neighbors to distract their populations and to boost the rally around the flag effect. That's what Vladimir Putin has been doing in the Ukraine. So autocracies are much more likely to be tyrannical, repressive countries that more likely to wage war against their neighbors. And so that's why I think that we should nurture democracy.
In your book, you're very critical of central banks and monetary policy. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, the central bank, particularly under Alan Greenspan, who became Fed chairman in 1987. Shortly afterwards, there was the stock market crash, the biggest fall, 508 points fall in the Dow Jones. I'd recently started as a bond trader at Goldman Sachs at the time, and people feared that this was the onset of another Great Depression, as followed the Great Crash in 1929. And so Greenspan, quite sensibly, tried to reassure the market by flooding the market with liquidity, lowering interest rates. And that was the right policy at the time. The problem was that he continued with the same kind of policy in the future when other problems happened in 1992. The exchange, what's called European monetary system or economic snake, which linked the European currencies together. This was before the euro came into being. And then Italy's, and then Britain's being booted out of the exchange rate mechanism, 1994. Then in 1997, there was the Asian financial market crisis. The year later, the Russia default, long-term capital management, large hedge fund default. Every time there was one of these crises, Greenspan had the same playbook of flood the market with liquidity, lower interest rates. But his policy reaction was asymmetric. Whenever there was stress in the markets, they would slash interest rates. But they didn't boost interest rates markedly whenever there was a bubble. Greenspan tried to jawbone the market down. He talked about the irrational exuberance of the market when it was during a fairly bubbly period.
Yeah, nobody wants to believe that it's a bubble, right? It's just good forever.
That this asymmetric policy of always reducing interest rates when there's crisis and doing nothing when the market's doing well, that conditioned people to believe that the Fed will always have your back.
Yeah.
And that encouraged far more risk-taking, and that's what allowed the build-up of huge amounts of risk, which then led to the global financial crisis of 16 years ago, between 2007 and 2009. But they inadvertently caused it because of this asymmetric policy. It conflated inflation and deflation of asset prices with inflation and deflation of prices in goods and services. But that's asset price collapses are completely different from a collapse in the price of goods and services. Now, over time, in a capitalist economy, the long-term trend of prices of goods and services is to go down. Just look at the prices of things like computers and electronics goods and cars. And the value has gone down over time, because of innovation and improvement and competitive competition. I mean, companies have had to use resources more efficiently, more effectively. The long-term trend in the prices of goods and services is negative. But because the Fed conflated deflation in asset prices, which is very dangerous, with deflation in goods and services prices, which is perfectly benign, they deliberately ran the economy hot. That led to a massive boom in asset price inflation.
Yeah.
And that was disastrous, because what are you most likely to get when you've had a long period of asset price inflation and asset prices are in a huge bubble? The bubble at some point is going to burst, and that's going to lead in collapse in asset prices.
Yeah.
By trying to prevent deflation in goods and services, it brought about inflation in asset prices, and that led to disaster when the asset price bubble burst and asset prices, in this case, home prices, collapsed. Now, there were other elements, of course, behind that. There were things like the Communities Reinvestment Act and Federal Reserve Acts in the 1990s, which further juiced the ideas behind the Community Reinvestment Act to encourage people to invest in real estate. All of these things were well-intentioned. I mean, the idea that people should own their own homes has good social intentions, but the effect of these acts and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loosening their lending standards in order to encourage home ownership. That was what led directly then to the subprime mortgages, which were the underlying problem behind the global financial crisis. Bank regulation as well, and that's only got worse since the crisis. Banks are now much more restrictive. That the Federal Reserve and the other central banks around the world, through the Basel Committee, much more prescriptive about how banks should manage and measure risk and how they should be capitalized. And there's no doubt that each bank individually, idiosyncratically, is better risk managed and better capitalized now than it was before the crisis. The problem is that because of the prescription that the central banks applied, banks are now much more aligned in the way that they take risk and measure risk and calculate capital. Lots of banks got out of capital markets businesses, especially the credit market business, because capital requirements for credit assets became much too high. So they abandoned those markets, which were taken on instead by hedge funds.
And private equity.
The hidden shadow banks are now doing equity. So the major banks became much more aligned in their business models. A lot of models followed UBS in focusing on wealth management. That's what Morgan Stanley did, and obviously Credit Suisse, which then blew up and got swallowed by UBS later on. We in the United States now we only have really three major capital markets banks, being JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Citi, and then Goldman Sachs, to a lesser extent Morgan Stanley. We've got a much more concentrated banking sector with much more aligned business models and much more aligned risk and much more aligned ways of taking and measuring risk. So even though idiosyncratically banks have more capital and are better risk managed, systemically the banking system is far more vulnerable now than it was before, because of the lack of diversity, and which has been brought about as a result of misguided regulation.
Yeah, and I like that. It goes back to those earlier themes that we were talking about. Like, everybody looks the same now. We're all aligned. We're all following the same things, and there's that lack of diversity in the system. And so if something triggers that in just the right way, we could be in big trouble. So I want to ask something a little more lighthearted, maybe poke a little bit of fun. So I'm sure with some of these views, you get labeled as a libertarian. And I'm just curious, do you label yourself as a libertarian, or is there something more nuanced that you identify with?
I label myself as a classical liberal in the mold of classical Victorian liberals like Robert Peel and William Gladstone. And liberals are they're capitalists to their core, but they believe in small government, but they believe in social liberty. We don't believe the government has any business poking its nose into the private lives or into the bedrooms of private citizens. We are socially liberal, fiscally conservative. So I don't align with either the Republicans or the Democrats. And frankly, all of no matter which party they're in, all of them have been fiscally incontinent over years. There's nobody in America who believes in fiscal continence and small government, really. They say they do, but they don't in practice.
So, fiscally incontinent. I thought you were going to say
taking political words and phrases and distorting their meaning beyond all recognition, as well as for mangling their pronunciation.
Yeah. I really thought you were going to say incompetent. So, he said the other word. I got it. Very good. So, Paul, after all of that, we talked about some really serious topics. What gives you hope today?
Technology. I mean, the technological advance has brought millions of people out of poverty. All the advances that were made by the Victorians in terms of healthcare and sanitation, which increased lifespans from an average age of about 40 to around 80 now. That's all been as a result of the scientific enlightenment, better understanding of the world and how things work, better technology. That's the great hope for the future.
Yeah. So you've written one book, and I hear that you're working on another one. So why don't you tell us about that?
My second book is called What Ails America and How to Fix It. And that builds on the ideas in the first book. It builds on the idea of human society being a complex adaptive system. And it has essentially 10 chapters, each focusing on some aspect of life in the United States. So one chapter on the way in which our government is organized, Treasury raises funding, one on crime and punishment and the legal framework, healthcare, housing, religion. There's one on gun control, racism. So these are big, broad themes. But as we've said, discussed in a complex adaptive system, things will morph over time. And I think that's led to a lot of the problems that we have now. The massive government debt, our debt to GDP ratio is truly horrendous. Aspects of our social welfare system, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, aspects of that, of those, have characteristics of a Ponzi scheme. And in fact, they assumed an ever-growing working population to support these benefits that have been promised. So that's what the book is about. As I say, it extrapolates from these underlying ideas of a complex adaptive system and applies them to all of these different realms. Many things we need to do are going to be unpalatable, like the problems that have given rise to the huge indebtedness of the government. Politicians haven't wanted to deal with it. They just kick the can down the road, leave it for somebody else in the future.
Sounds like a small book, just a few short chapters, not too many topics.
The file is just 130 pages. So one of the things I pride myself on is trying to cram as much information as possible into the smallest amount of pages with no padding and no waffle. Just let's tell it like it really is.
Well, I don't know how you do it. That sounds like a lot of work to cover that broad scope of topics and to keep it simple.
It is. A lot of people might criticize me and saying, hey, you're a physicist by training. You've had no formal training in economics. You've got no formal training in government relations or geopolitics or any of this stuff. How can you write a book about all these things? You know nothing about it. But my point is that in a complex adaptive system, the value of expertise is much overestimated because of this issue of experts tend to have their expertise in only a fairly narrow range of subjects. But complex adaptive systems, because of their interconnectedness, because they resist being compartmentalized and separated out, you need to paint on a broad canvas. You need people who can think about a wide variety of things. You can't just concentrate on one thing to the exclusion of all else.
It all comes back to diversity of thought. I love that. Paul, you've got one book so far. You've got another one on the way. If people want to find more thoughts by you, more content, where else can they find you?
I've part written a third book as well, which I hope to publish probably, if not before the end of this year, then next year. So the third book is to be called The Tragedy of the Climate, which is the it's taking an idea from economics, the tragedy of the commons. Yeah. The global climate is the biggest commons of all. So it's about global climate change, and of an idea of a fourth book, which is about the investor's handbook, how to think about investing, based on my lifetime's experience as a trader and now an investor. And the teaching element of that has always been of interest to me. Seeing the light. Somebody's eyes light up when they understand something that you've explained to them. Get a great feeling from things like that, which is why now now I've started to write books and I write articles, which I post on LinkedIn and other places, because I'm a great believer in education as the most powerful force for lifting people out of poverty and in improving lives. It certainly did that for me. And I want to pass that on for others. So that's why I'm writing books now, as a way of leaving an intellectual legacy and leaving for people a philosophy of how to think about things.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love hearing that passion about teaching and sharing your ideas and seeing the spark light up in someone else's eyes. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. It's always great to get your thoughts, and we'll put down below in the notes where people can find your books and find you online, and some of these other surprises. I didn't know that you were writing a book, Tragedy on the Climate. I'll have to look for that one too. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. The pleasure's been all mine. Thank you for inviting me.